Well, it's another Asia Brewers Network technical series session. Today we have an Ask Fermentis session, which will be on lagers, and we're joined by two familiar faces, Simon Jeanpierre and Krishna Rajiv. So thanks very much for joining us, guys.
Good. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Charles.
So with lagers gaining in popularity, we thought let's put together a webinar about how to perfect your lagers, and Simon is going to be sharing some tips and tricks on what you can do to improve your lagers if you're venturing into them to start with, or if you're already producing them and you want to perfect them. So as always, please ask questions. These are Q&A sessions. We're going to have a webinar to start with, and there's going to be a Q&A session afterwards. But at any point, if you want to ask any questions, please put them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And during Simon's presentation, Krishna will be able to answer them, and then we can roll into more questions during the Q&A session. So what makes these things really valuable is your questions during the session. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Simon, and he's going to tell you about the lost art of lagers. All yours, Simon.
Thank you, Charles. So the agenda for today on the lager will be first an introduction on the genetic background of the style, the genetic background of the strains, and then the style diversity in the lager segment. Then we will go through quickly the baseline study that we have done on our yeast, and then specifically go through a full and wider study on our SafLager W-34 70. Then we look at a trend, very nice trend at the moment, which is the relation between the yeast and hops and an interaction between yeast and hops. So we'll look at our lager yeast and how they are interacting with the hops. And then we will go through some fine-tuning tips for lager production, and finally a lager brewing troubleshooting guide. So a lot to see today. We have 25 minutes. I'll try to be quick. If you have any questions, of course, as Charles mentioned, please keep them for the end or just ask them during the presentation. So lager beer is a type of beer that is bottom fermented. So the terms of lager comes from lagering, from Germany, because back in the time where we didn't have refrigeration, so no cooling system, these beer were typically matured in the basements at a cool temperature, and they had also to choose specific time with lower temperature to ferment those beers. But today, of course, we are able to produce them all year long. And the yeast that is used in bottom fermented beer is Saccharomyces pastorianus, whereas in ale fermentation, so top fermentation, we're using Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So this style started when we had no refrigeration. So back in the days, it was fermented in the basement, and so the terms of lagering consist of specifically the secondary fermentation, the maturation, and the stabilization that is happening when you're lagering the beer after the fermentation. So this beer using Pastorianus strain, it is a strain that is more suitable for low fermentation temperature. So that's why it has been over the time domesticated and selected for the production of lager beer. What is happening during this lagering? So you've got different things that are of interest. First, the precipitation, because at cold temperature, you have more solids that are precipitating out of the beer because of their lower solubility at cool temperature. So that's why lagering is used to clarify the beer. We have seen from some studies that using a very low temperature is more efficacious than a higher temperature for a longer period of time. So if you can reach very low temperature, you will have better clarification during your lagering. Then we also see that it is impacting on the mouthfeel. It is really helping on the maturation of your beer. So a good lagering time helps in, for example, faster in reducing some off flavors and finding the flavors of your lager. Also before maturation, at the end of fermentation, to avoid some off flavors such as acetaldehyde and diacetyl, you also have to look at specific techniques that we will go through later on in this presentation. So the main difference between ale yeast and lager yeast is the fact that they are fermented at different temperature. They have also different sedimentation characteristics. So lager strains are pretty good at sedimentation. Ale strains are called also top fermentation because they tend to raise to the top of your fermenter during fermentation, whereas lager strains are going at the bottom. And then also it's lager strains, Pastorianus strains are very sensitive. So when we look at the way Fermentis produces lager strain, we are drying the strain to give you brewers a dry form of the yeast. And this process is very critical for the yeast strain. So thanks to our know-how and production process, we have still been able to produce so far 3 dry lager strains. The W-3470, S-23, and S-189. We will go through their characteristics later on in this presentation. So the lager beer diversity is much more diverse than what we might think when we go to a shop and when we have a very light lager, very refreshing kind of lager. It's not the only type of lager that you can find. So you've got the light lagers that are most of the time using some adjuncts to help in decreasing the strength of the flavor that you have to be able to produce a lighter beer and use less malt in comparison with the adjuncts. And then we've got the Pilsner's style, which are very well known, of course, originally from Czech Republic, from Pilsen city. And they were produced with a soft water, so it gives a very specific profile. Then we have the amber lagers using a little bit more of a special malt to give more color. Then we've got the dark lagers, because you can effectively have a lager that is very dark in color, and of course for that using some roasted malts to give this maltiness, to give this color as well. And then we've got also the bocks, which have higher gravity and so higher alcohol, so a more stronger kind of lager. Now I will go through the baseline study. So this is a study that we do at Fermentis with standard wort. So we study all our yeast with a very similar word with the protocol here described. And then we looked at different things. We looked at, for example, the apparent attenuation, and we see that for the lager strain, we have in average an apparent attenuation of 84% of attenuation. In comparison with the ale strain, for example, if you look at some diacetyl strain that we have, B134, for example, it is able to reach much higher attenuation, whereas for the lager range, we have very similar profile, very similar attenuation for the 3 strains that we have. Then on the residual sugar, you have here in gram per liter, the residual sugars that we have by using the 3 lager strains that we have in our range. So DP1, DP2 are glucose maltose. We see that almost all of them are fermented. Very few are left at the end of fermentation for all of the strains. We see that DP3 is also consumed. So the maltotriose, that's a complex sugars that not all the strains are able to consume, but Pastorianus is able to consume it. And then DP4, DP7, so the dextrins, that gives mouthfeel, so unfermentable sugars, almost remains totally in the wort. You can see on the far right-hand side that is a graph of the carbohydrate consumption during fermentation. So we see that typically the yeast will consume simple sugars because simply for the fact that it's just easier for the yeast to assimilate these sugars, and then it will start consuming the maltose once the glucose is almost depleted in the wort. The alcohol tolerance of our 3 lager strains is on a regular fermentation conditions. With regular fermentation conditions, you can reach up to 10.5% ABV. Of course, typically lager are much lower in ABV. And in lab condition, you could eventually reach 15% of ABV. Then on the flavor characteristics of these 3 lager strains. So at Fermentis, we have a beer sensory panel. So we are able to do sensory analysis of yeast, of the beer produced with our yeast strains on a very standard conditions and wort. And we are also able to use, of course, analytic equipment to go further and also look at the chemical compounds that are produced during the fermentation. So thanks to these results, thanks to these 2 tools, we are able to build here on the right-hand side. This is from the sensory. So this is a graph that is helping you as a brewer to make a choice on the best strain to produce your the beer you wanna produce, depending on the recipe, depending on the kind of flavors you want to develop. So we see that W-3470 is very central, so very neutral. We see that S189 is a bit more fruity, and S23 is really on the fruitiness and a little bit also of spiciness. But we will come back to that later with more details. So that is the baseline study. So that is a kind of a screenshot of the sensory profile of our strain and of all of our strain in similar conditions. But then we also have different studies that are looking specifically at one yeast strain. And for example, we will see here the results on W-3470, but under different fermentation conditions, so that you can use that as a brewer. You can use this as a tool to fine-tune your fermentation and really change the flavor that you want to achieve by choosing different fermentation conditions. So we during this study here on W-3470, we use different gravities, different temperatures of fermentation, and different pitching rates. And then we looked at the fermentation performance, so that is the kinetic. We looked at the volatile profile, and we looked at the sensory analysis. Here are on the right-hand side on this table are all the conditions that we looked at. So you see 14 conditions, that means 14 different beers, and then 14 different tasting, 14 run of analysis, the chemical analysis on all the volatiles. So that's a lot of work. And a summary of the result is on the following slides. So first on the fermentation performance, we see that it is pretty much linked to the density that you will have. If you have a high gravity, then the beer, then the fermentation would tend to be slightly longer depending on the conditions. If you have a good enough pitch rate, good enough temperature, then you can shorter this time. But we see that as a conclusion for this, we see that when you have a long fermentation time, that is either when you have a low pitch rate or a low temperature. So if you have good pitch rate, at least 50 or 100 grams per hectoliters for lager fermentation, then you have a shorter time of fermentation, and the same goes for the temperature. And here are the results on the volatile profile. So here the chemical compounds analysis. We looked at higher alcohol. We looked at the esters, and we see that if you look at the horizontal line on the graph, that is related to the flavor threshold. So when you have something under this bar, it means that it is under the threshold in the beer matrix. So when you want to produce a lager, you want something that is neutral. You want a neutral fermentation, a clean fermentation. And so as we can see here, no matter the condition that you will use with W-3470, no matter the temperature of fermentation, no matter the pitch rate and gravity, you are almost always under the threshold. So it means that you have a very clean and neutral fermentation. Then we assessed also these 14 conditions. We assessed them through the Fermentis beer panel. And what we see again is a little bit similar as before on the chemical analysis. We see that on that spider graph that you have on the right hand side, we see that we have almost all the time a very similar disposition of this spider graph, a very similar figure, which means that even though you change the fermentation conditions, the W-3470 will deliver the same fermentation performance and the same flavor profile. We see that on the bottom on the spider graph that we just opened, we see that there is some significant differences in the conditions, and they are mostly related to the fact that when you use a higher density, then of course you will have more sweetness that is perceived in the beer. You have also an influence on the higher alcohol and the alcohol perception from, of course, the higher ABV produced. But for the rest, for the floral, for the sulfurs, for the bitterness, it is pretty much similar, no matter the condition that you use. If you what we have noticed, so if you increase the density, of course that will increase the fermentation time, that will increase the higher volatile profile, but with no significant impact on the flavor that we see from the sensory. So the conclusion on this W-3470, the higher the density, the higher the fermentation time, as we have just seen on the slide before. And then if we choose a pitch rate, recommended pitch rate of 100 grams per hectoliters, we see that the higher the fermentation temperature, the lower will be the fermentation time. So you can really play on this, on the pitch rate and on the temperature, to decrease the time of your fermentation and eventually get your tanks ready for other beers more quickly. And then we see that if you have very low fermentation temperature, so 12 degrees or below that, you increase the risk of slow fermentation, of course, but also off notes. Now we'll go quickly through a lager yeast and hop interaction. So as I was introducing in the beginning, we looked at all yeast strains and also the lager strains and how they interact with a common hop such as Cascade hop. So we only used that hop, and we fixed the conditions of gravity, temperature, and pitch rate. And then we looked at how the yeast was interacting and giving different flavor profile with exactly the same hop regime and exactly the same fermentation conditions. So we looked, of course, at different hop compounds. You can see here a table of all the compounds we looked at through analytical analysis. And then here is a protocol that we used. So we used Cascade hop and 3 different hop regime, one being late hopping, one being dry hopping, and then a mix of the two, so late and dry hopping. And we looked at all our strains, and the output was fermentation performance. We looked at the fermentation performance, volatile profile, and sensory analysis, of course, again. So here is a PCA analysis for W-3470. So PCA analysis is a statistical analysis that really helps in clustering some observations with some variables. So we have here plotted in red the different variables that we used and that were assessed. So herbal, bitterness, after bitterness, fruity, floral, and general hoppiness. And then we have also all the observations, which are the yeast that we used in different conditions. So we see, for example, that for W-3470, all of the conditions, no matter the hop regime that you use, are very much clustered around the same area, which means that no matter the hop regime that you use, this specific strain will deliver always the same result. So towards bitterness, perception, after bitterness perception, and a little bit of floral, of herbal, sorry. Then if we look at S189, it is much more diverse depending on the condition that you will use the dry hopping. So if you use late hopping, it will be very much on a bitterness, after bitterness, and herbal. If you use dry hopping, it will be very much oriented towards fruitiness, general hoppiness, and floral. And then if you use a mix of the two, you will be somewhere in between these two conditions. And then the S23 is pretty much like W-3470. You see that they are clustered throughout the different hop regime. It's pretty much clustered around the same area. So bitterness expression and herbal expression. Globally, what we see is that the hop regime is actually affecting the way you will perceive the hop flavors. And also for every hop treatment, specific yeast will also deliver a specific intensity and a different quality flavor profile with the hops. And for Cascade, specifically, we see that S189 appears to be the most interesting one. So that is exactly the same study, but here we did one blanco. So we did one trial with no late hopping because we wanted to discriminate the fermentation flavor and the yeast and hop interaction specifically. So we ended up with, on the left-hand side, the result, the spider graph for non-hopped, so with no late hopping, but of course still some just no late hopping. And on the right, we've got the results in the spider graph with a hopped beer. And we see that, for example, on the non-hopped, we see a small variation between the yeast strain because, of course, fermentation is giving already different profile when using a different yeast strain. And we see that when you use hops, we have even bigger differences between the yeast strain, even though all the conditions, fermentation conditions and hopping are the same. We see that the yeast is really impacting and giving different flavor profile. If we look at this more specifically, so throughout all the variables here on the top of the screen, you have the results for the non-hopped, no late hopping beer. We see that there are some slight influences between one strain or another. For example, on the malt character that is more perceived with S23, we see that S189 is giving overall more hop herbal, more floral, more hop citric. And then if we look at the bottom of the screen, this is the result with hopped beer, and we see that it is increasing even more the differences that we have between the strains. So, for example, if we look at S189, it's giving a lot of hop herbal, floral, hop citric, also some hop tropical, fruitiness, global fruitiness that is very high in comparison with the two other strains. W-3470 is in between the two, and S23 is giving less floral, less hop citric, less herbal, but you see that it's, for example, giving as much hop tropical as the S189. So you can really play on that to fine-tune the flavor profile that you want to express in your lagers. Then some key takeaways just to summarize the differences between the three strains that we have available. So W-3470 is coming from Germany, from Weinstefan. It gives crisp and clean lagers. Then S23 is giving more fruitiness, more estery notes, so very suitable for European lager styles. It might, in some cases, leave more residual sugars in the beer. And then the S189 is giving very noticeable notes of floral and herbal characters. And both of the strains are fast sedimenting, of course, and having an ADF, as we saw earlier, of between 80 and 84%. So now on the fine tuning section, so fine tuning your lager, the first thing you can do if you want to play on the mouthfeel, you can play on your mashing temperatures. So here's a study that is showing the amount of the percentage of sugars that you get when using different saccharification temperature. So for example, if we look at 60 degrees Celsius, we see that we have like 61% of disaccharide, so maltose, 10% of monosaccharide. But if we look at 70 degrees Celsius of mashing temperature, we see that we are decreasing the disaccharide to 41%, decreasing a little bit the monosaccharide to 8%, but increasing the dextrins and increasing the trisaccharide. And so linked to that, you can have more residual sugar and fermentable sugars in your lager and play on your profile. Then looking at a pitching rate on your lager fermentation, if you have a low pitch rate, so lower than 80 grams per hectoliters, we see that you're increasing black phase, you increase the risk of contamination. In terms of aroma, you could have more esters because there is more replication of the yeast and therefore more ester production. And when you use a pitch rate that is too high, you might also have a very fast fermentation. So linked to that, maybe some H2S issue. And you have, of course, less biomass production. So also a more neutral profile that is expected with a higher pitch rate. Then on the temperature, as we saw earlier, low temperatures, so like 12 degrees Celsius, will have longer fermentation time. This is an example with W-3470 at 20 plateau, so high gravity. Of course, at lower gravity, you're of course reducing this fermentation time even at low temperature. And then at 16 degrees Celsius, you see that you are able to reduce much more the fermentation time, of course. And here the pitch rate was 100 grams per hectoliters. And then on the density, so here we have on the left a kinetic curve at 13.5 plateau, on the right hand side 18 plateau. So what we see is that we have, of course, longer kinetic of fermentation for the higher gravities, and pretty much similar profile when you look at a specific strain. It would just have longer fermentation, but kinetic is in any case quite quick, with 10 days at 13 and 14 at 18 plateau. And then if you want to play with the pressure, so the counter pressure that you have in your fermenter, this is something quite common in lager fermentation. Counter pressure, as we see here, is influencing your fermentation in the sense that you're forcing CO2 to stay in solution. So that's a little bit stressful for the yeast. It tends to reduce the growth rate of your yeast. And linked to that, you have less ester production and less higher alcohol production. So, so counter pressure is something you can play with to limit the yeast growth, and link to that to play on the flavor profile and reduce esters and higher alcohol. Now we're going to the lager brewing troubleshooting guide. So if you have slow or sluggish fermentation, what can you do? There are different causes, and linked to that, different solutions as well. It might be linked to the fact that you have a low amount of fermentable sugars. So check your mashing, check if you had proper mashing temperatures. It can be linked to the fact that you have an old yeast, low pitching rate, or also maybe inadequate nutrition. It might be also due to the fact that you have too much counter pressure, especially at the beginning of fermentation. As we saw on the previous slide, it is stressing a little bit the yeast. It can also be related to a low pH of wort. It can be related to a pitch rate that is either too hot or too cold. Pay attention to the temperature that you're using. So not higher than 30 degrees Celsius and not too cold either for the pitching. Then if we look at the off flavors, common off flavors that you have in lager production, if you have a beer that is too thin or acidic or astringent in taste, maybe there is not enough residual sugar in your beer. Maybe it can also be a possible infection or a too long lagering cycle. If you have high sulfur notes in the finished beer, you can look at your wort. If it's high in DMS, you could also look at your trub in the fermenters. Look also at your yeast generation. Look if the yeast is healthy and has a good vitality for the fermentation. If you have high grassy notes, green apple notes in your beer, then it might be related to a high production of acetaldehyde. Could be also infection from Xemomonas, for instance, microorganisms such as Xemomonas. Could be also insufficient zinc or manganese, so maybe add some nutrition. Look also at your yeast management and handling. Make sure that you don't have also oxidation post maturation, because if you have oxidation, then acetaldehyde is oxidized into ethanol is oxidized into acetaldehyde. And finally, some other off flavors like high buttery taste in the beer. Might be related to the fact that you're not reducing enough the diacetyl thanks to the yeast. So pay attention to a good VDK rest so that the yeast can finally convert the diacetyl into less active flavor compounds with a much lower threshold. Then on the off flavors, you can also have maybe a yeast that is slow to settle down or not settling down. Can be related to the mutation of the cells, insufficient calcium in your wort, or also a contamination. And then if you have a beer that is overly sweet, then check the amount of residual sugar in the beer. Check also if you did enough hop addition. That can also influence the overall perception of the mouthfeel in your beer. Check also for mutation of the cells. Yeast has to be very healthy to consume the sugars properly. So if you have any question on any of these troubleshooting, we can come back to them, of course, in the Q&A, which is now. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks, Charles.
So thanks a lot for that. Our recorded session will be ending here, but we shall be heading into our Q&A session now if you're listening to this live. So if you're listening to the recording, thank you very much. Don't forget to you can see more of our Asia Brewers Network technical sessions on our YouTube channel. So you can find that through our website, www.asiabrewersnetwork.com.